Okay, next story that we're going to talk about is the Rashomon Effect. Now, your author does something very interesting in this article. He takes a movie that was filmed, probably 50 years ago. I think it was in the 60s. A Japanese movie, I believe. Your introductory material probably tells you this, so if I'm wrong, you'll get the facts right there. He takes a movie that was filmed a long time ago and uses it as sort of a basis to explain what happens to us in the real world. And this movie, at the time, was a very sort of novel idea. A movie had never been made like this. And what they did was they had one occurrence one happening during this movie, and the director shot it from the perspective of each of the main characters in the movie. I believe there were four main characters, and so like the first 15 or 20 minutes of the movie was shot from the perspective of character one. He saw the events leading up to this occurrence, he saw the occurrence itself, and then you see kind of sort of his interpretation of the occurrence. Then the next 15 or 20 minutes they go to character two. Same thing, sort of an instant replay, but from character two's eyes. See the events leading up to the occurrence. You see the occurrence and his interpretation of what happened. And what happened in the movie is this couple, this man and this woman, come together and have a sexual encounter. But one character thinks that, it's this great love story. These two are in love and they come together and it's just wonderful. One character thinks that the man rapes the woman. It's a brutal, horrible thing that he does. One character thinks that the woman seduces the man, that she's like tricked him and trapped him into doing this. So it's from each character's perspective, and a lot of things go into this. Some of it is just like actually what they saw. Some of it is their experiences, their background that skew how they interpret what they see. Some of it is their level of interaction with the occurrence. And so, as I said, at the time it was a very sort of novel idea. We've now had several movies that were shot like that. There was one a couple of years ago. I believe it was called Vantage Point, a movie about, and maybe I have the wrong name, but I think it was called Vantage Point, movie about an assassination attempt on a diplomat, and they sort of show this event from the eyes of several people in the crowd where this happens, and then at the end you sort of piece it all together and figure out what really happened. And so that's what this movie was like. So your author takes the idea of this movie, the idea of how our perspective, our experience skews how we interpret things, skews how we see the world, and applies it to a couple of very famous product liability cases. Now, these liability cases are very old, back from like the 70s, and at that time, it wasn't as common for people to sue. Product liability cases weren't as common as they are these days. I think these days we're a little more jaded than we were then, but the same effect, the same ideas still hold true. He talks about the Dow Corning case with the breast implants, and he talks about the Pinto case, the recall of the Ford Pinto. And he talks about how, what the public perception of these things were. The public perception was, with Dow Corning, oh my God, Dow is putting out this product just killing women. They don't care about their consumer. They're just killing them. They know that these things are poisoning them, but they just want the money. That's what we saw. That's what the public saw, these poor women who were sick and who were dying because of these breast implants. And there was some media information, released that Dow knew that these things were happening and they just kept selling the implants. They just wanted the money. Well, let's look at it from a different perspective. First of all, I don't know, but I'm fairly sure there was no one working for Dow Corning who took any woman and held her down and cut her open against her will and shoved these implants to her body and sewed her up and refused to let her take them out. That's not what happened. These breast implants were a voluntary procedure. A breast implant, I know that they're very important to some women, but they're not a medical necessity. You're not going to die. It's not like a pacemaker or certain medication. You're not going to die without it. So it's a purely voluntary thing that you do. Anyone knows, and even back then you knew, if you stick something into your body that is foreign to your body, there's a chance that there could be some problems with that. And if you don't know that, you're just foolish. If you don't know that, every set of implants that was ever sold came with a little insert. You guys know how when you buy medicine or anything these days, you get the little leaflet that tells you all the things that could happen to you because you're taking the medicine. Same thing with the implants. Even that long ago, they all came with a little, leaflet that said these are all the things that could happen, possible side effects, what they knew at the time. And all of those always have that blanket disclaimer at the end and other things that we don't know about, right? Every single pair of implants that was sold had one of those with it. So every single woman who had a pair of implants could have had that information had they wanted it. Now, a lot of women, I'm sure, never even looked at that leaflet, but it was provided to them. What else? Not a medical necessity, purely optional. Also at the time, it's important to note that at the time, this medical grade silicone, which was in these implants, was being used for a lot of other medical purposes. And I think your article touches on this. And there were never any problems with the other medical purposes. So there was never actually any absolutely definitive proof that the silicone in these implants, when they would leak, caused the health conditions to these women. Could it have exacerbated it? Sure. But was it the absolute cause? There was never any definitive proof that that was true. As a matter of fact, with most of the women who got sick, they had some kind of underlying medical condition that contributed to that, or they had that before the silicone leaked. And as I said, the silicone was being used for other medical grade purposes, and it was not, causing death, causing illness. So there's some questions about that. But what we as the public saw was horrible, horrible big corporate America taking advantage of the poor little consumer who just wants to look beautiful, taking advantage of them and killing them. These days, I think we would be a little bit more jaded about that. But at the time, there was like a national outcry. Everyone was on the side of these poor women who were victims. Sort of the same thing with the Pinto case, a little bit different. Not really, though. Ford does a study and they say, what do consumers want? Companies do this all the time. I mean, that's how they make a living, providing us the products that we want. So they do a study, what do consumers want? Consumers at that time wanted a gas efficient, fuel efficient vehicle, cheap, wanted a cheap car. So Ford rushes through the process and provides them just that, cheap, fuel efficient car. Very small, some might say just a virtual death trap. I mean, if you were ever in a Pinto, very lightweight, very small, very inexpensive. You got what you paid for, basically. Even at that time, a Pinto was a very inexpensive car compared to other cars. Very fuel efficient, but very inexpensive. So basically, the consumer got what they paid for. If you buy something that is cheap, you're getting something that is cheap. Now, in the design of the vehicle, there are a couple of cars that explode. They're in wrecks and they explode. It comes out that in the design of the vehicle, there was a gas cutoff valve that could have, I'm not going to say should have, could have been placed in the line from the gas tank to the engine, could have been placed in there so that on impact it shuts off gas flow, reducing the possibility of explosion. Now, gasoline, explosive. Any vehicle, if hit at the right angle, in the right way, could explode. We all know that. We've seen it. Any vehicle could catch on fire. Even today, the cars have these cutoff valves. Now, back then, not every car had them. So it wasn't really so much a defect in the design of the Pinto as it was a choice that the company made because they put out a cheap product. They just didn't put that, even though it was only a couple of dollars, they just didn't put that part in there. Now, could the car still have exploded? On the right impact, any car can explode, even if they have the fuel shutoff valve. So, that was never really brought out when they talked about, again, big, bad corporate America just killing people because they want money. One of the things that really came out in the media that I think really hurt Ford was there was, in their internal memos, their internal information, there was a memo where they found out that on a certain impact, these vehicles could explode. Now, as I said, with the right impact, any vehicle could explode. I don't care how many safety measures they have because there's a combustible material in them. But with the right impact, these vehicles could explode. They went to a government study. This was not even their study. They went to a study that had been done by the government that said the average cost of a wrongful death suit at that time was, I think it was like 200,000. It's in your article. But this government study gave the average cost of a wrongful death suit at that time. Ford saw this study and they said, hey, kind of did a cost benefit analysis, which companies again do all the time. And they said, hey, the percentage of cars that will be impacted in this particular way and explode will be, this much, very, very small, very, very few. Compared to, the hundreds of thousands of Pintos that were out there, is going to be a very, very small number. And the average cost, according to this government study, of a wrongful death suit is $200,000 or whatever it was. So multiply the number that might explode by the 200,000. That was cheaper than recalling all the vehicles. So they decided to just take the risk of the product being out there. Now again, media portrayed it as a defective product. Media portrayed it as some kind of conspiracy. It really doesn't make sense. In both of these cases, let's think about it. Is a company going to put a product out there and intentionally kill people? If I kill you, you're not going to continue to purchase my product. If I kill you and other people find out, they're not going to purchase my product. So does it even make sense that a company would intentionally try to kill someone? But that's how the media portrayed this. They just want money. They don't care about lives. They put this value on life. Well, first of all, they didn't put the value on life. Our government did. They just used the numbers. Second of all, they did a cost-benefit analysis. Like I said, companies do that every day. Does that make them horrible? Or does the consumer, as with the Dow Corning case, does the consumer carry some responsibility? I bought a cheap car. I got a cheap car. I stuck something in my body that's foreign to my body. There were consequences to that. I mean, at what point, in all honesty, in these cases, early 30, 40 years ago, the public blamed corporate America, and we still tend to do that. Our current economic situation, we blame the banks for taking our homes. We borrowed the money, and I hear this all the time, but the bank let me have the money. But you knew you couldn't afford the payments when you borrowed the money. It doesn't matter if they let you. Where is your own personal responsibility? You borrowed the money knowing you couldn't make the payments. Now you can't make the payments, but it's the bank's fault that they take your home. How is that the bank's fault? It's just like the credit card companies. Oh, well, they gave me the credit. They let me charge up hundreds of, tens of thousands of dollars. It's their fault that I'm in financial trouble now. Yet again, did they come to your home and put a gun to your head and say, charge this, buy this? No, they didn't. At what point, what this kind of Rashomon Effect article asks is, at what point is it our responsibility? How is it that we as consumers skew our perspective to always make it somebody else's fault? Is it really Ford's fault that this accident happened, or is it partially your fault? Is it really Dow Corning's fault that these women are sick, or is it partially the consumer's fault, or is it all the consumer's fault? You could have never gotten sick from an implant if you didn't put the implant in. They could put the implants out there on the shelf all they want to, but if you don't buy it, it can't hurt you. So why are we skewing our perspective to always make it their fault? Is it their fault? Do you think these days that we look at it a little differently? Like I said earlier, I think we're a little more jaded these days. We don't look at it so much as corporate. We still don't want to take responsibility, but we at least admit that it is partially our responsibility, even though we still want to find somebody to sue to hold responsible. Why do we do that? And is that right? Is that wrong? Do they have that responsibility to protect us from ourselves? I mean, basically, that's what it comes down to. Do they have a responsibility not to put a product out there that would harm you at all? Do they have a responsibility to protect you from yourselves? And again, this starts with the perspective of how we skew, how we interpret what happens based upon our experiences, our background, and, basically our own motivations. Something for you to think about.